Welcome to the Envision Rise podcast. I'm your host and CEO of Envision Rise, Stacey Hegarty. Joining me today is Aneace Haddad. Aneace is an executive coach as well as the author of The Eagle That Drank Hummingbird Nectar. Welcome, Aneace. Thank you for joining me all the way from Singapore. I'm always excited when we get international guests on the show. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you. Wonderful being here.
Well, first, you and I have had a chance to chat, but why don't you tell our listeners about yourself, about your history, and we'll get started on all the things that get you excited about leadership and personal growth.
Yeah, so I'm in Singapore. You can probably tell from the way I look and my accent, I'm not really Singaporean. I've been here 17 years. Before that, I was in France for around 20 years, Italy, and before that, Colorado. So I kind of grew up. My first job, I went to CU Boulder. My first jobs were in Denver as a programmer, very long time ago. And I quickly discovered that I was more of an entrepreneur than a programmer. So eventually I created my own company in the south of France, a payment software company, and grew it to 30 countries, sold it in 2007 when I was 47. Went through a midlife crisis, a divorce, moved to Singapore. So a lot of stuff was happening. And then in that process, very painful, difficult process, I discovered I liked people more than computers. And it brought me into executive coaching. So
well, it sounds like you did a midlife
I try to do that in a
well.
short. I try to bring that down to a smaller number of words. It's kind of hard.
That's okay. People are here to listen to you. So use all the words you want. That's a pretty big transformation to go through, actually, to go from computers to people. And I know one of the things that you enjoy talking about is how AI can humanize the workplace. And that is completely the inverse of what we're hearing on media, that our robot overlords are coming to kill us. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a nice overlap for your two different career paths.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Great question. I'm not a rose-tinted glasses person, Pollyanna and all that. There are some real big issues with AI, which I think we're all kind of aware of. However, the positives that I see, the big positives, it's accelerating this very generalized move from valuing knowledge and valuing having answers and valuing all the stuff we know. And it's pushing us into a new phase where we value the questions that we ask more deeply. We value the wisdom that we can bring, the true creativity that we can bring. So I think AI is really pushing us to explore what is really unique about being human. And it's all in the connection space. It's all in the messy areas. So I think AI is very powerful for that. It just helps us get the other stuff, realize that the other stuff isn't as valuable anymore.
That's so interesting because so I have a 15-year-old daughter. And of course, like most high school students, she's kind of wondering where the shortcuts are and can AI help her with her homework and all those kinds of things. And we've had sort of the ethical conversations around that. But then when we really got into it, I think she was saying what you're saying, that Mom, I don't need to memorize these facts anymore. The quadratic equation is right there for me on Google. I can just fill in a few numbers and it does the calculation for me. So where does that put us with regard to education? And by way of extrapolation, where does that put us when we're looking at the future of work? And what that's going to potentially look like for people who are either still in high school or just starting out their careers, and they're going to see this huge transformation over the course of their work life.
It's going to be difficult. I remember back my last year of high school, it was also the same year the first Texas Instruments calculator came out that was a pocket calculator, basically. It wasn't this big computer thing. However, in the last year of high school, they still required us to learn how to use a slide rule. And their explanation was, you don't know if the calculator runs out of batteries or something. You still need to know how to use a slide rule. So there's this holding on to the past. while at the same time the new stuff is coming in. My father was a university math professor, and he loved the fact that he could do very complex arithmetic and multiplications and divisions in his head. And I would go like, what value is that, Dad? I think this is just an extension of that same kind of process, but maybe on steroids. It'll be culture shock for a lot of us. It's going to be difficult for a lot of us to go through.
I had a physics teacher in high school who still used a slide rule. And he would shame all
Yeah,
of us with our calculators. We're not really learning. I think about him once in a while when I see everything that's happened in technology. I graduated from high school in 1990. So everything that's happened since then. And I wonder what he thinks about that because he was so
yeah,
set in his ways already with his slide rule when it was just a calculator that he was kind of railing against. How does that translate into what executives and leaders need to be thinking about now? Because you mentioned this is going to be a tough transition for a lot of people. But when we're looking at the folks in their early 20s who are just starting out, this won't be such a bad transition for them. It's people like you and I that are
yeah,
going to really struggle with this, who still have time left in their
yeah.
careers and didn't start out this way. How do we stop ourselves from that? Well, the way we've always done it has worked well enough, and all of this newfangled stuff is just a
Yeah,
trend that's going to go away because AI is not going away.
yeah. Another wonderful question. And I have ideas on it. I don't think I have answers on it. But
Mhm.
the first thing is I'm amazed that in 1990, you have a story of a slide rule when mine was 1978, 77, 78. So I'm just amazed that that was still going on 11 years later.
It was just that one
Um,
guy.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's good. It would be interesting to see where he's at today. You know, so around a year ago, I decided I would stop working with people under 40. And I mean, coaching
Mhm.
individuals and C-suite teams. And the reason for that wasn't ageism or reverse ageism. The reason was that I had coached so many people in their 40s and 50s that I had started to see a pretty clear transformation process that kind of happens organically when we're at midlife. And I've come away from that thinking. I have a new book coming out in a couple of months on soaring beyond midlife. The subtitle is The Surprisingly Natural Emergence of Leadership Superpowers in Life's Second Half. Because I've really become convinced that the things that we go through at midlife can help us develop a more, how to put it, change friendly mindset because we've gone through big changes during midlife. And if we can leverage that and say, okay, yeah, I had to let go of all these labels and identities. My kids are growing up, they're leaving home, they don't need me anymore the way they used to need me. My brain isn't working as fast as it used to be. I forget the kid's name, I forget the spreadsheet, the cell on the spreadsheet.
Mhm.
So I'm going to let go of being that person who manages every single detail, and I'm going to develop a bigger picture because at the same time, my two hemispheres are communicating better so I can connect the dots easier. And it really feels that there's something in that process that could be very valuable for people to leverage, just
Mhm.
to become aware that they are already resilient and they do go through change, and they've gone through some really difficult changes at that point in life, that these are just other changes.
I love hearing that because personally, I am in midlife, whether I want to admit it or not. But professionally, when I'm working with clients, so often what I hear from the younger end is, these fossils don't really understand how the world is now. And then from the older end, I hear, some version of these lazy whippersnappers, and they don't understand the value of hard work. So as people are gaining the experience of life and kind of becoming more of their true authentic leadership style, what should we be paying attention
Yeah,
to in ourselves as we start looking at, because I know the way I led as a young leader in my late 20s is
yeah.
completely different than the way I lead now in my early 50s. What should we be looking at? Because when I see the people who have not changed their leadership style at all over the past 30
Yeah.
years, it scares me a little bit.
Yeah, I've come up with a framework of three winds of change in midlife. One of them is physiological, our bodies change. Second one is neurological, our brains change. Third one is parental. And I was actually the first one I discovered around 10 years ago, coaching leaders. And you see that shift, exactly the shift you're describing in our parenting styles. So when our kids are younger, we're more KPI driven. We do a lot more hand holding. We show people, we model things, we role model for them. And then when they grow up, already in their teenage years, it's getting a little more difficult. And then post teenage years, we shift. So we become by force we adapt and we start going, okay, well, if they don't want to hear my advice, which is really, really good advice, but they don't want it, what value do I have as a parent? And that kind of question from most people go, they might not ask exactly that question, but something is going on where they do find value. It might be in presence, it might be in connection, it might be in a very deep, genuine faith in the person, which the person might not have themselves, but seeing in another's eyes that. So I think it's exactly that same transition that we go through in parenting. You see it in C-suite leaders often tend to have teenage kids. I'm really super generalizing. And they still have something of a KPI mindset. Board members generally tend to have adult children and they've moved beyond that and their sense of empowerment has grown through that process. So I love using these parallels because everybody has gone through things like this and you can take parallels from one area and use them in another area.
I love that idea of where C-suite tend to be in their lives compared to where the board tends to be in their lives. And if you just look at those two very different kinds of leadership roles, it lines up so perfectly with their family life in general. Obviously folks have all sorts of different kinds of families and structures, but I think that's perfect. Now, what about, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the cultural changes that have been happening. And they've been happening for some time. I just think social media and 24-hour news cycle have definitely sped it up a little bit. And there's a lot more awareness about how the larger cultural influences in our society are really affecting the workplace. Are you seeing people pushing back on that? Are you seeing leaders struggling with, I don't get all this stuff that's happening out there in the world with people, whether they're talking about pronouns or transgender people, or, it could be any number of things. What are you seeing in the leadership world for people trying to adjust?
Yeah, I think your lens is going to be a lot wider than the lens I have. Mine is going to be quite tunnel visioned. So as we spoke earlier, I'm based in Singapore. The vast majority of my clients are multinational organizations. They have quite a big mix of cultural and language differences in their teams. However, it creates something of a third culture kind of thing where they kind of step out of that. So from that perspective, and that's why I do this, because I've lived all my life in that kind of very mixed cultural environment. So what that also means is that the very specific cultural things that emerge, like in the US, are not necessarily present in the same way. People are aware of it, but I don't often see questions around that. There is a desire for greater diversity, and there's already a huge amount of diversity. The kind of diversity that some companies still struggle with is more women at senior levels. But then you have countries like Philippines, India, even Malaysia to a certain extent, where women are very, very high up. Turkey, there's so many very senior women in banking. So it's hard to say because some of those cultural things are quite specific, specific to certain countries.
And I think you're absolutely right about that. As we become a more globalized economy, this is a fact, it is happening, it's going to continue to happen. What guidance would you give to an organization that, is maybe US based or North America based, that is starting to spread its wings into a more international organization? How can we be more inclusive? How can we leverage the diversity that comes from being a multinational organization to make that a strength for us rather than a source of conflict or something that, I mean, things like that could take down a company if it's not done well.
And it can take a decade or more, 2 decades for that to really assimilate into the headquarters, into the core company. I don't have an answer to that. It's a
But people want
difficult
a
process.
checklist.
I know. I'm not very good at those checklists.
Me neither.
I definitely see culturally a very different world today than 30, 40 years ago. I was born in Texas. My father's from Iraq. My mother's American from the Texas area. And by the time I was 18, I had spent half my life overseas, already spoke French fluently. My whole life has been immersed in this multicultural environment. And 30 years ago or so, that was considered very weird and strange and different. And today, there's so many people like me. And I think we've really come to the point where we understand that there are a lot of people that think really well in other parts of the world. I don't have all the answers. It's not as big a problem as it used to be.
Yeah,
I don't have a checklist.
One day I'm going to find someone who has a checklist, because people often ask me for, like, I think a lot of times that's what leaders are hoping, that someone will pull this list out of their pocket and say, okay, here, do these 10 things and your life will be so much easier at work. And it just doesn't work that way. Now, you did write a book I mentioned earlier. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. You just use ChatGPT. Ask ChatGPT, what do I do now? I'm growing my company internationally. Give me five top ideas. It'll give them to you.
You might want to research some of those ideas. Our little baby ChatGPT isn't quite ready to do all the thinking for us yet. So you did write a book called The Eagle That Drank Hummingbird Nectar. And I'd like you to talk to our listeners about, first of all, what does that mean? What does that title mean? And what should they be expecting out of that book?
I didn't want to write another traditional business kind of book. So this is a novel. However, it is a heavily fictionalized account of my transformation at 50. So there is a protagonist who's not me, who is going through change, and he had sold his company in France. So there's around 20, 25% of the facts and stuff in the book that really are me. But by going to a novel genre, it allowed me to explore things in a much deeper way than simply, here's what I went through. So there are fictional constructs. There's an underlying theme which reveal at the very end of the book, gives it completely different meaning. So then you start to understand the story from a different angle, which you can only do with fiction. But it explores that difficulty at midlife to let go and find your identity and value in things new that you've invested heavily in the past on, but you're not invested anymore in it. And yet that's your identity. So there are a lot of subtleties that we go through. So that's what I wanted to capture in that book. The title comes from two dreams. There's a dream at the opening of the novel and a dream at the end of the novel that kind of bookend this person's process. And the opening dream is of an eagle that's languishing and dying under a pile of wet leaves. So it's just kind of smothered. And then at the end of it, the eagle is drinking hummingbird nectar and completely recovered. The analogy is that we can find sweetness in life. If we just come into these changes in a very defeatist mode, we're going to smother ourselves and our eagle will not soar. But finding the nectar in life, the little things that give us pleasure, that can really be rejuvenative. So that's kind of the Eagle that Drank Hummingbird Nectar.
Thank you. It's a beautiful book, and I've recommended it to lots of folks my age to please read it, because it applies so well over so many things in our lives as we have the good fortune to age. And whether that's in our personal life or our professional life or our community involvement, we do have the good fortune to age. And how that happens to us has to do with our mindset on so many levels. Obviously, there are things we can't control, but there are so many we can control our mindset, and we can take that again to our families, to our friends, and to our places of work. So thank you for writing that book. It really
Yeah.
is a beautiful,
Oh,
beautiful
thank
piece
you.
of work. Well,
Thank you for
we
your
have
lovely comments. I get goosebumps.
well, we will be featuring it on Rise Reads, as well as your new book coming out, Soaring Beyond Midlife. So I think those two go really well together. And I think,
Yeah.
depending on what our readers are feeling like that day, they could have, or our listeners, I suppose, whatever they're feeling like reading that day, I think it has a little bit of something for everyone. Aneace, where can people reach you? How can they find out more about what you do? Where can they find your books?
So my first name has a very unique spelling, Aneace, which allowed me to get the website quite easily. So everything is at aneace.com, aneace.com. That's got links to LinkedIn. It's got links to the book on Amazon. The book is all on Amazon. There's a Kindle version, paperback, hardcover, and an audio book for that. So it's all easy to find, thanks to a very, very uniquely spelled first name. Thank you, Mom and Dad.
Well, Aneace Haddad, it has been an absolute pleasure. And after talking with you, I'm feeling a whole lot more empowered about my age instead of feeling a little unsure about whether or not I was still
Oh,
going to
you're at
be
the
okay.
perfect time of life.
Well, thank you so much. And we do appreciate you being a guest today. For those of you who would like more information about Envision Rise, you can find us at envisionrise.com.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And so with your help, we can get this message to more people. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, and be a part of making a difference, because it starts with you.